good afternoon or good evening, depending on what side of the globe you're on, referencing one of our friends from the other side of the world, Steve Griffiths. This is Talking Air Filtration, NAFA's Talking Air Filtration. A really good webinar here. Last I saw, we are going to have about 450 registrants, so thank you so much for joining us here. This is the hospital air filtration in the world of COVID-19. We have some awesome experts and seasoned individuals here who have seen, they know a lot because they've seen a lot. So we've got Steve Griffiths, Joel Swann, Jim Rosenthal, who will be moderating for us, and Chris Zaker here. Before we get started, just want to run through just a couple items here about NAFA if you're not familiar with NAFA or even all that NAFA does. NAFA is a great place to network and do business. At our events, and I've overheard people say, relationships forged in NAFA justify every dollar spent on dues and the meeting, and so it's really true. And so people here are really good friends and do a lot of good business together. This is a great place if you are in the industry, especially a distributor, but also a manufacturer, to nominate your customers for a Clean Air Award, especially if they have some really cool technology or have some especially clean air due to your hard work. So go to NAFA.org. The deadlines for nomination is August 1, and then you have to be a NAFA member to do this. And a lot of NAFA members don't know about this, so please check this out. It's a great way to get some notoriety for your clients. We also have some NAFA guidelines that are based off ASHRAE's standards. And so our members have gotten together and put together these guidelines that are centered around specific applications. One here we have airborne infections containment rooms in healthcare facilities. So a little apropos to today. And so there's firing range ones, there's library and higher education facilities as well. They're completely free. Go to nafahq.org. NAFA has some really fantastic credentials that are offered for all different types of folks in the air filtration profession. If you're a business owner, or your salespeople, you should consider getting the CAFS, this Certified Air Filtration Specialist, and then potentially consider getting your field techs, their Certified Technician 1 as well. So again, all information on is on our site, and it has some really great education centered around this as well. Coming up in November, we're still planning on the annual convention. We usually have a bit of education, a little bit of golf, a little bit of nice dinners, a great awards presentation. We did have to cancel our technical seminar, so we might have a little more education than we normally do. So please take a look at that and check out the website for details on Clearwater for the annual convention. If you've got any questions, we want to hear from you. You can email us. On the other end of this email is the lovely Ms. Terry Driscoll. She'll take really good care of you at nafahq.org. We really want to thank our sponsors. This is the list of usual suspects that are at our tabletops. They're sponsors, they have booths, they're always there to support us, put on some great presentations and talks as well at our annual meeting. So thank you to you guys as well. If you want to stalk us or follow us, you can do that on pretty much everywhere, LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter. We also have a great LinkedIn group, so if you want to join there and really focus in on chatting with some air filtration professionals there, I encourage you to do that. We also do have just a couple things to cover here. We've got, if you've got any audio problems, make sure that you change over to the phone call or vice versa, or to the computer audio. We have some dial-in numbers. That's going to be in the email that we sent you. And then ask any questions in the questions pane that's on your control panel there. And then the handouts for this presentation should already be loaded into the handouts panel at the bottom of that. So Jim, I left you off the hook for that. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Jim Rosenthal. Thanks so much, Jim.
Thank you, Tony. I've been looking at this group, and it looks to me like we have about 100 years of experience in the air filtration industry among the four of us. So I think we've probably sold a few filters and changed a few filters and know what we're talking about. So I think you'll really enjoy this series of presentations, and please feel free to ask questions. Use the panel for asking questions. And with that, I'll introduce our first speaker. His name is Joel Swann. He's an HVAC professional with 30+ years of experience in the design and manufacture of heating and air conditioning equipment. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Kentucky. He's an applications engineer for the Southeastern US for AAF Flanders and focuses on commercial filtration applications, high purity HEPA filtration, and gas phase filtration. He is a certified air filtration specialist with NAFA, an associate with ASHRAE. He's also been involved with AHRI and NIST. He's a NIST certified trainer. He is also a certified Lean Six Sigma Black Belt and a licensed contractor in the state of Florida. Joel Swann.
All right, thank you. We should have parsed that down getting started, but thank you very much. And thank you, Jim and Tony, for the platform today and getting this all set up. We'll just go ahead and jump right into this. Again, please bring questions. We've got a lot of times these presentations are just going to take out the front, and then we're looking for questions. So please, as the slides are going, you get a question, go ahead and start firing them in. Go ahead to my next slide, Tony. And it's not, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to give you this perspective from a manufacturer standpoint where we came from. And it really started with the early market trends. Now we started receiving questions back in February and March before everything started shutting down, because you in the hospital medical industry started getting the calls and were getting tipped off that this storm was coming. So we got this wave, and when the wave started, we didn't have all the recommendations that we have now from the professional organizations and think tanks. But here's what we saw, and here's what we kind of did. The first thing we did when the calls started coming, we found out COVID was about a 0.12 micron in size. So we started looking at HEPA filtration, and we had a lot of hospitals come to us immediately saying, I wanted to upgrade everything. We had to work with the corporate and the technical people to kind of make that work because of the fan systems and existing to make them work. But we did go to HEPAs as much as we could. And we also went to upgrades in ASHRAE. Originally kind of looked at the MERV 16. With MERV 16s being a different design, that also took a little bit of time and a little bit of maneuvering sometimes. So the next two bullets that you see there, we actually had some initial responses of changing out those filter rats and actually modifying air handlers immediately. We saw this 100% economizer mode. We offered that as well. Just ventilation was known. The one thing we saw back in the spring was airflow. With that going to 100%, a lot of people, you know, I'm in the southeast, but all the way as spring came upon us, the loads of those filters became overloaded because we were running 100% versus year over year. So we were advising, and we, you know, still, if you haven't looked at that and you were running 100%, you need to go check that and make sure you're not getting some bypass by overloading. And then finally, we saw the advent of negative pressure rooms, temporary. You know, we saw the tents and coming up with conditions on tents and garages setting up. And then the advent of UV lights. And boy, we're going to talk some more about UV lights, all the panelists. Those guys have been doing a really good job. Go ahead, next slide, please. There we go. The other thing I saw in an early market trend and that we received was what I called the long-term response plan. So that initial wave was to try to get the HEPAs and the MERV 16s in as quickly as possible. But we also saw the ordering of PM changeouts coming in faster. As you may guess, from a manufacturing standpoint, this is not just me, but across industry, all manufacturers have been loaded up with filter orders. They've come in very heavy. So if you're on your maintaining your regular PM schedules, make sure you order earlier than you have in past years. A huge demand on the industry right now. The next bullet is that we saw as an early market trend is air filtration is moving from occupant comfort to life safety. I first heard this in an ASHRAE meeting in New York City, and it's gained, it took traction there, and I've seen it gain traction and maintain. You know, when this first happened, we wondered what the post-COVID-19 world was going to look like. But what we're talking about at occupant comfort is filtration is the unseen thing. It's the neglected part of the HVAC system because you can't see it working. And so primarily its function has been to remove pollen and occupant comfort and keep the dust out of the rooms. Now with the advent of COVID, we're looking at it as actually a life safety issue. I mean, it truly is a life and death issue, particularly for you all in the medical industry. The other thing we saw is those of you that did not make the immediate moves, we saw capital improvement plans being just, kind of set up and executed per normal. Next slide, please. All right, so again, just to kind of walk us through where we've been and where we're going. The market trend, we started out with CDC saying this wasn't an airborne transmission, and then we started getting reports. ASHRAE issued, created a pandemic committee, and they issued a statement on airborne transmission that it should be controlled. And they also offered that MERV 13 or MERV 14 preferred or best achievable. So we started looking at this airborne transmissions through bioaerosols, and it started coming on board. Now, CDC finally in May 21st of this year, they have not said that it's an airborne, nor has the World Health Organizations or other international organizations, but they have recognized that filtration and containing those bioaerosols and controlling them is important, so much so that CDC has issued a MERV 13 or highest compatible with the existing filter rack recommendation. Next slide. All right, so when that MERV 13 came down, it became a huge demand. Prior to, we were kind of looking at 16, 15, 14, we were kind of across the board working with different folks. But once the MERV 13 minimum came, a push from all of industry, not just the medical, but as businesses are opening up and schools and colleges, there was a big demand for 13. So whereas we used to have MERV 8 as your first pre-filter and a very common thing, that's the way we were set up prior to COVID. Manufacturers, again, not just mine, but all manufacturers were set up to meet the demand, right? We set up to meet demand. And now that demand has shifted. It's shifted so much that we're seeing a 300% increase year over year in MERV 13 filters. Now, that's 300%, I'm gonna say, with a bullet. I mean, anybody of older age, the bullet and an anchor, but this is with a bullet. This number is still going up. The demand continues to climb. So this has put a big push and demand on the market. So what we're recommending and sharing with you all that are here today is, if you can't get that MERV 13, if those ship cycles are out there, go up. Look at MERV 14, 15, 16s and see if you can make them work in your systems and check the availability. The other thing is remember that the recommendation says, or as best achievable. So this is a short term, but in an interim period, if the demands for 13, 14, 15, 16 cannot be met, consider a 12, 11, a 10. Any improvement in MERV rating and efficiency mitigates the risk of those bioaerosols that contain the COVID virus from going out there. Again, consider that as a short-term solution. Long-term, follow that recommendation. Next slide, please. Okay, the other thing that's happened with the COVID demand is the melt-blown synthetic shortages. Now, these are used for gowns and medicine masks, so they have pulled on that supply, as well as these are used on high efficiency filters, MERV 11s through 15s. It's this lofted material that you hear about in filters. So that demand has also way exceeded supply. There's some requirements to get government first out on the masks and gowns. And so there's a shortage. And unfortunately, the bad news is, I got to share, I'm not the bearer of bad news, but that is affecting the price of those products and of that material. Next slide. So finally, that's the bad news. The good news is we need to start looking, and we need to encourage the market and those of you in attendance to start looking at filtration as a total cost of ownership. On the left side of the screen there, you kind of see this price driving buying decision. And if you look at that, I've got a driver, which is my manufacturing cost, then I get a margin, and then I get a price. And of course, customers love to beat me up on that margin, and that happens all the time. But let's look at the things that are remaining idle when you're only looking at a price-driven decision. You're missing out on filter efficiency. What are we trying to accomplish with COVID-13 response? Is to improve that efficiency. Dust holding capacity. Again, in COVID-19, we don't want them in there touching that filter. So can we find a dust holding capacity that's better? That affects the time and labor that's spent on it, the pressure drop of the different filters. All those things are sitting idle. So we'll jump to the other side, and this TCOD driving buying decision, and what this is an attempt to look at all of those factors and weigh them out. And multiple manufacturers have ways of doing that, but what we need the market to paradigm shift is to look at the overall cost, and that may mean getting your energy management teams. Again, medical, you all are good about having energy management teams, but getting the facility manager and the energy manager together to make this all over total cost ownership decision. And that wraps it up for me. It's called Q&A. Jim, back to you.
Thank you, Joel. Very well done. And again, if you have questions, feel free to put them on the screen. So our next speaker is Chris Zaker. He spent 25 years in the air filtration industry, first 22 of those years with Glassfoss. 3 years ago, he became president of Filter Technology, an independent filter distributorship in Columbus, Ohio. He's been very involved in NAFA, served on many committees. He's a past president in 2014, 2015. He lives in Lancaster, Ohio with his wife, Tricia, and 3 daughters, 2 of whom just graduated from high school. And he is a very active softball coach and is currently a softball instructor. Chris Zaker.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. First off, yes, I'm going to join Joel in saying thank you to NAFA, to Tony, and to Jim for putting this on, as well as to everybody here in attendance. So thank you very much for your time. I'm going to try to be, everybody that knows me knows that I take 10 minutes to explain what takes 2 to explain. I'm going to try to do the opposite today. I'm going to try to actually move efficiently, certainly at the beginning. As we get into this with the Q&A, I might take a little bit longer, but for right now, let's go ahead and zip right through this. Go ahead, next slide, Tony. So when the three of us, when Steve and Joel and I looked at this big picture concept of hospital air filtration in the world of COVID, it's interesting that we all hit the same concepts, but we attacked it from different angles, like we had discussed earlier today. We're all looking at this from a slightly different perspective. Joel's presentation, as you saw, is very much the here and the now. Here's what's happening. It's you would say the reactive thing. That's what we're doing. My approach that I'm taking is really more along the lines of what we did yesterday versus what we need to be doing tomorrow. And as you see on the screen, leading up until this year, in addition to human comfort, the primary driver of the filtration used in the hospital was essentially there to protect the hospital, to ensure that the environments are clean so that obviously patients aren't, getting sick from one another, keep the coils clean, et cetera, et cetera. And if you talk to purchasing folks or maintenance folks, the filters, A, they are a burden, but B, they have been considered an expense. It's not like an MRI machine that's going to generate revenue for them. It is an expense. It's a burden. And many, now this doesn't mean all, there are a lot of hospitals out there that actually are more progressive and are doing more than the minimum. But at the same time, in my years, I have seen quite a few facilities that are just willing to do the minimum, which according to ASHRAE, according to Facility Guidelines Institute, minimum must be good enough. But I submit to you that we need to do better. Next slide, Tony. So when we look at the existing guidelines that are out there, ASHRAE 170, the Facility Guidelines Institute, essentially, if we can oversimplify this for systems where there are 2 stages of filters required, you're essentially looking at a MERV 7 pre-filter and a MERV 14 on the final filter. Now, there are some areas within the facility where a single stage MERV 13 by itself is needed, but we're going to kind of exclude those because I'm focusing specifically on the patient care areas. But strangely enough, within these hospitals, the minimum is still MERV 14, even for surgery centers. And we're going to get into just a second how MERV 14 could very easily not be MERV 14. But this is going to help explain that there's a tremendous difference between the minimum requirement versus the best practice. And just as Joel mentioned earlier, that these hospitals wanted to increase their use of HEPA filtration. HEPA filtration is absolutely going to be the best case scenario. MERV 14 is the absolute minimum. As it stands right now within a hospital, the HEPA filter is really only truly required in two areas: in an AI room, or in a pharmacy if they're mixing chemo drugs. That's part of their. That's actually a recent development that they have, that they need to have HEPA filtration in there. So this brings the question: if we think about surgeries, if we think about the areas where air is recirculated within the hospital, is MERV 14 good enough? I submit that it's okay. And we'll see just in a second. Just like the AT&T commercial says, sometimes just okay is not good enough. Prior to COVID-19 showing up, it was fair enough. It was okay to just leave well enough alone. Tony, next slide. Okay, one more. We're going to bounce back to that, please. Thank you. So just like you see, and yes, this was stolen from the AT&T commercial. Oddly enough, that specific commercial was the one with a doctor coming in saying how he just got recertified, et cetera, et cetera. Just okay is not, certainly not in 2020, dealing with what we're dealing with, not only on the exhaust of hospitals, but also now on the intake side, that we have got to do better as those who are making the recommendations, those who these hospitals look to for the guidance. We cannot sit on our heels and say, okay, if that's what you've always been using, then that's what you're going to continue to use. I submit that in the near future, hospitals are going to start looking at these items. And I'm going to lump all air treatment together, whether it's UV, whether it's filters, whether it's other technologies that are out there, that they're going to start thinking about these things as an asset on their balance sheet as opposed to as an expense. And there has been, and you don't have to look far on Google, and you can see a plethora of research, certainly quite a bit in the last couple of months, on the value of higher efficiency filters, of UV lighting, when it comes to dealing with this type of stuff. So that said, this type of constant pounding of the information going to management, we may start to see more upper level management in hospitals getting involved, as opposed to this being handled by the maintenance staff, by purchasing, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that has concerned me from day one is we've been looking at the minimum standard, like I mentioned a couple of slides ago, versus the best practice. When we start to make these changes, when we start to really adopt better technologies, and that becomes the new minimum standard, I kind of am excited about what the new best practices be, because we're gonna have to figure out ways of thinking down the road and say, okay, we're doing really, really good right now, so what's next? So this brings up the question about the HEPA filtration and its use, or its usability, I should say, with regards to stopping virus-sized particles. Those of us who are in the industry understand that there are more filtration mechanisms at play than just straining. So straining, if you think about it, would be like your chain link fence stopping your dog, or your screen and your screen door stopping a fly. So that would be, the particle simply being larger than the hole through which it's trying to go. But when we're dealing with particles in this size, that straining filtration mechanism has no play. We are using 2 or 3 of the other filtration mechanisms, diffusion, electrostatic attraction, in capturing those. And it's because of that. Tony, put that last slide back up showing the inverted bell curve. Thank you. so just like you heard Joel say that that coronavirus has been identified at being about 0.12 microns. Strangely enough, coronavirus, this is not its first trip here to the U.S. So back in 1993, there was an ASHRAE research paper entitled "Investigate, Identify Means of Controlling Virus in Indoor Air by Ventilation, Filtration, and Source Removal." And back then, we're talking 27 years ago, they had determined back then that the coronavirus can range anywhere from 80 to 160. But if we just use the average, we're at 120 nanometers or 0.12 microns. That is much smaller than most filters can handle. However, if we look at this is the best example that I've been able to find either online or anywhere. When we're talking about HEPA filters and their ability to stop particles, and we've used this 0.3 microns kind of as our measuring stick. The reason behind that is because that is about the size that is the most difficult to capture. Everything larger than that, we can capture at a higher rate. And strangely enough, everything smaller than that, we can also capture at a higher rate. So when we're thinking about the viruses being only 0.12 microns, yes, that's substantially smaller than 0.3, but in this chart right here shows the smaller micron, we're actually capturing at a higher rate. So the minimum would be on the 0.3 micron size particle. And oddly enough, if you look at, and anybody on this call can Google this, if you Google MERV, that's MERV, curve, you can see several images online that show overlays of MERV 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 16, and look at their efficiencies by particle size. And it is really strange how every single filter will show the least efficiency on about the same particle size. So it's because, again, of the filtration mechanisms at play. So, okay, the final slide, Tony, you can go probably forward 2, I believe. Yes, okay. So what is Nirvana? Nirvana, obviously, the best we could do. Do we have the opportunity to bring HEPA filtered air into the entire facility? And do we have the ability to also have HEPAs on the exhaust air? Possible? Sure, it's a matter of time and money. And like Joel said, maybe you need to make some modifications to your equipment, to your fan. There are some places that simply just do not have the space or the financial means to do this. But that is in the long term probably going to be your long-term best practice. There are some situations, and again, Joel mentioned this about using 100% fresh air and 100% exhaust. There are some newer systems that are capable of handling this. One of the considerations of that, and in fact, I just spoke to one of the hospitals I deal with earlier today, that they are in that exact same mode. Their system is designed for this. Now, they do have and plan for less air changes per hour, simply because they don't have the inclusion of the recirculated air as part of the economizer. And they're also not getting the same cooling capacity because now what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring in 85-degree outdoor air in central Ohio that's 75% RH, and it's a lot harder to bring that down to the correct temperature and relative humidity than it is on the recirculation side. So there are some financial burdens and engineering constraints of doing this. With the newer facilities that already have that in place, switching that over to that pandemic mode is easy. It's just difficult because when you bring in 100% outside air, Joel lives in the South. That's expensive. That air needs to be cooled. Even here in Ohio, it's warm enough. That air needs to be cooled. So there's still a gap between hospital needs and what's really possible. So I go back to the CDC recommendation that said, basically, go to this MERV 13 or the best you can. So if they can increase the efficiency from 11 or from 13 to 14, they can do this. But the one thing I must caution is that more often than not, increasing filter efficiency can come with some consequences, i.e. higher resistance to airflow, which in turn is going to result in lower air changes per hour. So they're going to have to look at possibly rebalancing their system based upon the type of product they go with. You know, if you go with from a pocket filter to a 4V cell, for example, you may not have that negative consequence. But I guess the warning is to those who are on the call, and there are some HEPAs you can go to Amazon online and buy, and it's got this beautiful header and it's going to fit where your bag filter fits. I'm going to warn you, do not do that. Those of us in the industry, we've had to fix situations that have been created by somebody just taking that initiative on their own. So moving on to the next point about proper installation of all filters is a must, 100%. Dr. Jeffrey Siegel did a research project a few years ago that proved that a MERV 14 filter with a gap, with bypass around it, will drop to MERV 8 actual efficiency. So just because you, as the hospital administrator or the maintenance director, you are buying and installing a MERV 14 filter, the end result, which is the air cleanliness, you're not getting MERV 14 air. So you have to be super cautious. You have to make sure gaskets are used, etc. And in the future, we're going to see additional controls in addition to filtration. And we're really starting to see a lot of this right now because additional options can be added that will not add to the pressure drop, i.e. A UV lighting system. And the last point I make there, and in fact, you're going to have to just kind of use your mind on this, but I think we actually might see something like this come down the line. You know, imagine some sort of an automated room cleaner, a UV light, a lithium-ion battery-powered UV light that sits on top of a Roomba that goes into these various rooms at night when nobody's there. I think that may come down the line. Last slide, please, Tony. My hope is that these 5 organizations start to get together and start to plan for the future and think, okay, how do we bridge the gap? How do we narrow that gap between minimum requirement right now versus best practice and get those into standards that can be written into codes to protect not only the hospitals more, but also all the patients, doctors, and nurses. And that is all I have. Tony, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Another great job. So our next presenter is Steve Griffiths. He is the general manager and owner of Independent Filter Service based in Melbourne, Australia. In a prior life, he worked and studied in behavioral science field in Sweden and Australia, which occasionally comes in handy running a business with over 20 staff and hundreds of customers. Outside of managing the company, he is vice president of the local junior Australian rules football club, which I'd love to hear about someday. Steve is married to Michelle and they have 3 sons, 15, 13, and 11. Steve?
Thanks very much, Jim, and thank you to NAFA for hosting such a great event and a timely one as well. As a distributor and predominantly a filter service company for hospitals, I'll be giving a brief snapshot of what we've been experiencing out in the field down here in Melbourne, Australia. Just some background. First, Australia has a population of just over 25 million people, and Melbourne is our fastest growing city with just over 5 million people. And it's predicted that we'll take over Sydney's population by 2026. Go Melbourne. Due to our fortunate isolated geographic position here in Australia, and with the benefit of having some more time to act and prepare, Australia so far has avoided any large waves of COVID-19 infections. So I empathise with other countries and various states in the United States that are currently going through some very difficult times. But at the start of the build-up of COVID-19, our preparation of filtration systems in hospitals in Australia would be somewhat similar, I'd imagine, to other parts of the world. We service several large hospitals in Melbourne, and from early March, there was a ramping up of meetings for preparation before the government enforced the inevitable shutdown on the 22nd of March. We were promptly issued with state-backed documentation from the hospitals to vouch that our company was an essential service provider. So along with servicing supermarkets and major food producing plants, this documentation helped us stay confident that would remain in operation out in the field during these very uncertain few weeks in March and April. Next slide, please, Tony. Thank you. So most of our service staff have had many years experience in servicing HVAC filtration in hospitals. Before COVID-19 hit, the hospitals, as you guys probably already experienced, already had a number of stringent requirements before attending site. And that was number one, do not attend site if feeling unwell, you have to be 100% healthy, use the PPE as required, and there's always restricted access to isolation rooms and other critical care areas. Once COVID-19 hit, our hospital sites began to implement additional measures such as temperature checks on arrival for contractors and visitors, mandatory P2 or N95 face masks, of course, and no access at all for those staff that had recently travelled overseas or interstate. Within our own service department, we implemented some new policies, such as we started with staggered starting and finishing shift times. We also increased our social distancing where possible and bumped up the stringent personal hygiene. Hand sanitizer in our vehicles, soap and water wherever we could get to, and really ran that message down to everybody with the stringent personal hygiene. This helped reduce our staff, the risk to our staff and the customers and the occupants of the hospitals, of course. Fortunately, we haven't been exposed to many COVID-19 patient areas yet, as our case numbers are relatively low, but however, the COVID-19 patient areas are still present in the facilities and hospitals we service. As per the photo on the right, you can see there, these patient areas are well signed with details, including PPE requirements. Thanks, Tony. Next slide. At a major hospital in Melbourne, this site added to their existing ICU capacity by converting old disused wards into critical care areas in preparation for the potential influx of COVID-19 patients. This meant that decommissioned HVAC equipment needed to be revived to serve these new critical care areas. H14 HEPA filtration grade filters were specified by the facility to be retrofitted into existing filter holding frames. An example of one upgrade can be seen on the first two photos here, which show the original MERV 9 two-pocket filters from the decommissioned unit on the left from a long time ago, was then retrofitted with H14 V-cell HEPA filters installed in the same HU in the middle photo. This meant we needed to work with the hospital engineering department to ensure not only could the frames hold the weight of the new filters, you can probably see those additional steel supports, but a new fan and variable speed drive was also installed to overcome the huge increase in pressure drop of the new H14 filters. You can see that blue fan there on the floor there in the middle photo. To prepare for COVID-19, we also saw a number of facilities upgrade their isolation rooms and install specifically designed exhaust filtration units consisting typically of three-stage filtration, starting with a MERV 10 cardboard pleat, followed by a MERV 13 pocket filter, and then a H14 HEPA. And this replaced their old existing hardware. The response by our healthcare facilities was immediate. Many of the projects we undertook to retrofit and upgrade these systems would generally take approximately 2 to 3 months, whereas these installations were required within days. So we had to be innovative and work with our mechanical contractor peers to provide the best tailored solution within a very tight time frame. The typical Easter holiday break we normally enjoy down here was put on hold this year. Hopefully next year we'll get a longer Easter break. Thanks, Tony. Next slide. Because we had some forewarning about COVID-19 in Australia, our hospitals and healthcare facilities took the opportunity to bring forward scheduled filter replacements in emergency, intensive care and infectious disease wards to ensure these areas had sufficient airflow and were not disturbed during the onset of COVID-19. There was real potential that these areas could have been restricted with access later on. Our peak for COVID-19 cases in Melbourne was forecast to occur around about mid-May to early June, and luckily it didn't turn out that way. But the service deadlines to get these filters installed back then meant there was a strain on our stock levels, as well as other local distributors. And naturally, we could not wait around for the 12 or so weeks lead time from our typical normal shipments from the USA to arrive. The collegial effort by some of our other local distributors meant that we could help each other out where we could, and most of the target installation deadlines were met. So it was a team effort by many people. Next slide, thanks, Tony. The COVID-19 pandemic has shone a light on the importance of good filtration in hospital areas. We've seen hospital facility managers look to upgrade filters serving non-critical areas to mitigate risk, as Joel touched on earlier. Thankfully, most of the hospital facility managers we work with already understood the importance of HVAC filtration and reacted very quickly to upgrade their systems and prepare for the worst case scenario. Other facilities and industries as well have also investigated the advantages of upgrading their filtration. And I'm sure there's many others in our industry that have experienced the countless inquiries requesting a filter that will stop coronavirus, or the occasional facility manager looking to upgrade his 2-inch MERV 9 pleat to a H14 HEPA filter with, of course, no increase to pressure drop or recalibration of the fan or airflow. This demonstrates to us the need to discuss and educate our customers about the relationship between filter efficiencies, typical target contaminants, and resistance. This is something we also experienced earlier in January this year when bushfires here in Australia caused a lot of smoke haze across our cities and regional towns for a number of weeks. As I mentioned, thankfully, hospital facility managers here already understood the importance of their filtration systems, and they just needed a very quick response to get the filtration they required installed in preparation for the COVID-19. Thank you very much. Appreciate your listening.
Some questions that have been coming in. Okay, we have a series of questions that we would like to ask the panel, and we also have some questions that have been coming in. Let's start off with the ones that we've prepared for the group, and we'll have one person start the answer, and then the other two can certainly pitch in to help. So, Steve, what changes have you seen in the hospital market, air filtration market, in the last 6 months?
It's a general upgrade across the board, and filtration has become part of the arsenal for protection, as Joel touched on earlier as well as Chris. We've had minor upgrades such as MERV 13 to 15, MERV 15 to H14, and we've seen an increase in sales of these more efficient filter types right across the board. And that was occurring pre-COVID, but really ramped up in the March-April period.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that one. So we talked about in my presentation how we started without recommendations, and then once that recommendation came from MERV 13, MERV 14, one that certainly impacted it in the 6 month. And then I like where Chris was going with future as well. But one of the reasons MERV 13 was kind of selected, there's been a X-ray study on the flu. And so this short-term window, again, we can get to HEPAs in the future, but this interim that we're in, part of the reason that MERV 13 was selected is in this study, if you looked at no filter at all, and again, this is looking at other viruses, it's not COVID as this is new, but if you look at other viruses with no filter, there was a 7.9% risk of infection. Again, this was an ASHRAE study, but it was 7.9 with no infection, or risk of infection with no filter. But if you added just a MERV 7, which is hospitals, and most hospitals are using MERV 8, but just that MERV 7, it dropped to 3.1. At 11, it dropped to 2.2. At 13, it dropped to 1.9% risk of infection. And then the other key thing is it stayed MERV 14, that risk of infection in the study at 1.9, 1.9 up to 15. At 16, it dropped to 1.8, and then at HEPA, it went to 1.7. So again, that study was called on by ASHRAE as they came up and made this recommendation to MERV 13 for the short term. That's where that's going. In the next 6 months, or part of the 6 months, where do we go with this? And it goes back to that, to me, of comfort versus life safety. And we need to look at filters, not look at them as a commodity, and not look at them as an expense, again, as Chris mentioned. And it really shouldn't be. And I believe, if you look at the air filtration industry right now, we're really in its infancy. If we look at all the things going on and what we're learning and how much air impacts our lives, we're really at the beginning, and we're finding out more and more on that with the advent of clean air and the technology that goes. We've come a long way from keeping dust off of a painted truck kind of thing. So, and then the last thing that I just want to talk about, in the very near future, the technology is there in the next few months, is technologies, the sensors, and we're seeing the use of PM particle counters and pressure drop monitoring to monitor that filtration system. That's available now and in response to COVID-19. So that's my snapshot of 6 months.
Let's go on to the next question. By the way, that study that you referenced with the Wells-Riley equation, that was actually sponsored by the NAFA Foundation, done by Dr. Brent Stevens. So if you want that, it's actually on the website for members. How have the recommendations to move to high efficiency filtration, MERV 13 and above, from ASHRAE and the CDC and other organizations affected the hospital air filtration market? We're talking basically about supply. And Joel, you had some information about that. Chris or Steve, would you
add to that? We are seeing that, and I mentioned in this interim time to look at just up and just below, go up to where you can of a higher MERV and efficiency, and then start looking down as an interim solution. And that strictly interim, but, that is recognized by the CDC as making the comment that fits your filter rack, because, MERV 16 filters are manufactured different than a MERV 13. They do have a higher pressure drop, so they're designed differently and they're going to fit in the rack. But I will also say there's lots of products out there that can go in and accommodate those systems. There's multiple solutions that we can look at, that can provide a lower pressure drop and a higher dust loading. Again, you can take that total cost look, but if you do that, there's ways to actually lower overall cost and accomplish that efficiency, that high efficiency, and bring it down.
Steve or Chris, any other comments?
I've got some, Steve. Okay for me to go?
Yep.
Yes.
All right. So the best phrase I can use to help describe this, and it's a reference to a movie. It's A Perfect Storm. So in that movie, they're referring to these 3 storms that all came together and formed this unbelievable superstorm out in the ocean. And I believe we're kind of right on the cusp of seeing that right now. And the proof of this is something that Joel had already said when he mentioned that his MERV 13 volume is 300% over last year. So we have a tremendous demand. And I haven't seen it specifically in my market from the healthcare industry as of yet, because for the most part, they're already there. Where they need those efficiencies, they're already there with the second stage. So, but where I am seeing it is outside the healthcare market. I'm seeing it in school districts, commercial buildings, industrial facilities. We're starting to see a lot more demand for higher efficiency there. So that is happening at the exact same time as the demand for the media manufacturers to convert their machines to make PPE, to make masks, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a tremendous increase in demand and a tremendous decrease in supply. So that disparity, and Joel had already mentioned it, that disparity is going to create extended lead times, higher costs. So we've already seen this with HEPA filters. When COVID first came out, bam, there was a rush on HEPA filters and lead time shot out. Every manufacturer in the industry had an issue getting HEPA filters out the door. And with some, that's still continuing. We're seeing this now with MERV 13, and we may see that this bleeds over into other filters, into, as as those customers that we're using, for example, just MERV 10 plates, and they want 13s, but they can't get 13s. Now they might be looking at possibly a MERV 14, or like Joel said, maybe even higher. So until we get this disparity between supply and demand a little closer together, we're going to be in this pitch. We've got this perfect storm going on.
Yeah, these are interim solutions.
Okay,
I agree.
let's move
It's just an interim recommendation type solution, not a.
Let's move to the next question. I think that, Tony, can you move to the next question? Okay. I think we've pretty much answered this, but we had a question online, a couple of them actually. Some of our viewers have had experience in the past with hospitals being very concerned with their budgets, and filtration has always been a area where they want the lowest cost possible. Have you seen anything change on that in the last few months? Are people starting to be aware that there are other things besides just the cost?
Yes, I can start that one. What we saw originally and initially before the organizing bodies and the think tanks started making recommendations, there was no, money was no cost. It was no object. I was just get it. We had to get things done. We had to get the EPAs in there. We had to get upgrades and create these isolation room type of thing. After we did, suppress the curve, now kind of control is taking back over, and that budget question is coming back in. Looking at it, I mean, it's kind of like the old flip phone versus an iPhone. If you want to make that big of a step in efficiency, it's going to cost that. But what you do is if you can look at that total cost, what you're going to get for that higher efficiency, if I can get longer dust holding capacity and a filter performance curve that is less pressure drop while it's accepting that dust, then I can lower the cost of energy such that there is a lower cost. But that's where my opening where I was just talking about, we got to get those people together. And I believe, I've been able to demonstrate it and find examples of absolutely we can go to higher efficiency at a lower cost.
Yeah, I agree with Joel. The total cost of ownership equation has been extremely important down here. The budget restraints have become less and less an issue, but look, hopefully that stays the same in the future. But filtration has become, as I said earlier, part of the arsenal, and we've really seen an increase in the importance of what facility managers are doing with their sites. So yeah, that's an excellent point, Joel.
Okay, let's move on to the next question, Tony. So we had a little bit about this, but what measures are you recommending for the protection of personnel changing filters in hospital environments?
Right. I'll start this one. That we're looking at PPE. We got this question early, and we're just gonna hold off because ultimately you all in the medical community are responsible and liable for your the safety of your people and what's going on in the environment that this filter is capturing. So I can't really give a recommendation. What I can share is best practices, and thankfully the pandemic committee from ASHRAE put those out. And what we know thus far. It's a respirator, and I would certainly follow this in your hospital applications and even outside in maybe offices and doctors' offices if there's been a known exposure. Eye protection, disposable gloves, a complete bunny suit or at least gowned up. Those are, again, CDC recommendations as well. And then the bagging of filters. And it's, I don't know, Steve, maybe you all been bagging filters. I've heard other, outside of America, that happens a lot. It's now, especially with COVID, go ahead and do that. And then the rule of best practices says to take those filters, bag them, and they can be disposed with regular disposal, dumpster type removal.
Yeah, sure, Joel. Yeah, we've been treating any unit that's near a COVID area as hazardous waste. So yeah, it's a two-man operation, and we're utilizing those full PPEs as you mentioned, including face respirators. And disposable overalls, gloves, sealed eye protection. And yeah, it's really important to get rid of the old filters in a legally required way. And yeah, it's really much, you've got to be prepared for the worst case scenario as soon as you go to change out a filter these days, especially in hospitals.
Springboarding off what I mentioned earlier, how I said that my opening presentation was more forward-looking. My presumption is that, you know, we're see even more of this. That you know, yes, the safety precautions are absolutely in place for, you know, HEPAs that are on the exhaust side of you know, patient isolation rooms for obvious reasons. At the same time, you've got filters on the exhaust side of other rooms that maybe we didn't know the patient had COVID, because we didn't know that that patient was positive for 4 days later. So what I suspect may happen, and this may come down from the CDC, is taking the precaution just like you would treat any gun as if it's loaded. My presumption is the CDC is going to come down and say, any filter that comes out of a hospital, you have to assume there's COVID virus in this. It's not the way it is now, but that's my guess. That may come down the road.
Sure.
Okay. Next question. So how are you handling the critical areas like emergency room, critical care areas in hospitals? What steps are you taking to protect those areas? Steve, I think you had some points on that.
Yeah, I was just talking about earlier how where there are critical care areas, especially with COVID patients, we've been able to keep out of where the actual patients are, and most of the access to our units are external from outside of the hospital itself on the external side of the building. So as we touched on earlier, we're using full PPEs before we even enter these areas. In some cases, where the patients are, and we're prepared for this, we've got experts that are accompanying us into these areas. And that way, we're not just walking in blind. We're actually getting accompanied by someone from the engineering department as well as from the medical team. So we're definitely booking these times in well ahead, so we're not causing any surprises before we arrive.
I'd like to chime in there a little bit. I'll be quick. The hospitals with which I deal with, those who have the capability, and I'm not talking from a filtration standpoint, more from a controls perspective. Those that have the capabilities have switched their airflow, both supply as well as exhaust, from the emergency department into what's determined pandemic mode. And that's 100% exhaust. It's through HEPA filters. It leaves the building. The incoming air is cleaned to at least, ASHRAE 170 standard. And they're able to meet their air changes per hour. They're able to maintain temperature to some extent until it gets 95 outside. And everything's going well right now. But not every hospital has that. So those that don't have those capabilities are just being more cautious. They're being more patient aware. All these hospitals have their precautions, taking temperatures, full-blown surveys of the people before they come in, checking in contractors, every visitor, et cetera. And that's it.
Okay, question from online. With the rising demand and limited supply, prices are going to go up. When do those prices become price gouging?
Right. A fair enough question, but this is not a gouging issue. It is this is a reaction to the market. It's a rule of supply and demand. It's not like they're going up and the supply is there. So there's laws that are followed and required that address price gouging, but I can just tell you that's not what's happening here. And again, it's not just relative to one supplier, one manufacturer. That is across industry.
Okay, next question. So we've taken care of some critical care areas. What about the non-critical care areas? What are we doing in hospital environments where you don't have COVID patients to protect everybody else?
Yeah. Okay. We're jumping. I'll address the non, basically the flow that we're looking for in the hospital. And again, this is from Mass Ray Standard or Standard 170, but you want to have those high purity areas. I believe Chris mentioned them earlier, the pharmacies, either your ORs and EDs. You want those places to get the highest pure air, and then you want to control the pressurization out. Now with the COVID and the isolation rooms, those rooms, by the way, are going to be positive pressured, and then progressively step down as you step down for the cleanliness needed for the use. So when you get into like public, it's still clean air. I'm not saying it's not, but you want that pressurization of your buildings to step down in that manner, and then eventually to where you've got the dirty air, and that would be where the air is exhausted, and then tie in with that exhaust a COVID isolation type of room. But with that, I'd also like to add, we've been talking about what the future holds. One of the things that I'm hearing and thinking and seeing is with the hospitals, what we can do in hospital design going forward. What we've learned is a lot of these things, a lot of the folks that came and called on me, I couldn't help them because their existing system was tapped out at the high end of where their air could move. And so future designs, what we're looking at is the ability to not necessarily oversize your fan, but oversize your ductwork, so that if you do need to go to a purge cycle, if we do need to go to 100% exhaust, a lot of hospitals unable to go to 100% exhaust because the ductwork just wasn't sized that way. And so to do that and add these convertible pressure rooms, a lot of negative pressure rooms that I've seen in hospitals, have the controls and the dampers so that it can be positive or negative. But again, just to add that to the design for both critical and non-critical areas in that hospital.
I'd like to add something onto this, Jim, because this is something that I've been working with one of my customers just recently, and it's not a hospital per se, as it is an elective surgery facility. It's a place where, and we're seeing more and more of these. All over the country. To get your knee surgeries and shoulders and elbows, et cetera. And let's face it, the baby boomers, the largest population demographic in the country, we're getting older. And that means there's going to be more knee surgeries and more shoulders. And it doesn't make sense economically to do those in the hospital setting, which is why these surgery centers are popping up. And these places conform to the same standards as a hospital. But here's what I'm seeing with this place in particular. So what they had was a two-stage filtration system with a MERV 8 or 10, I think it was a 10, pre-filter followed by a MERV 14, and they had a UV light system shining on the downstream side of the coil to get them the single pass kill rate of mold and fungus, et cetera, also keep the coil clean. And they wanted to do better, because when they were shut down, if you shut down one of these surgery centers, they're losing thousands and thousands of dollars per day from all these lost procedures. So as part of the reopening plan, this place wanted to make sure that when they were providing air into their operating room and recirculating it throughout the facility, they wanted to be 100% sure that they were not recirculating anything that was going to harm somebody else. So we did it in steps that their system could handle. So one was to swap out the MERV 13 header style product with a much higher. We weren't able to go to HEPA, obviously, because that's going to require a change in the filter housing. But we were able to get them up to a MERV 15 in the header style. We had them install a second set of UV lights, and that's downstream of everything. And those are actually installed upstream of phase 3, which is going to be a rack of 5V HEPA filters. And the concept there, and then after all that's done, they're going to have the contractor come back in. He already knows he's got the room on the fan, he's got the room on the motor, so he already has a plan that, you know, they're going to ramp it up, they're going to rebalance the entire facility, but he wants to have HEPA filters as the final stage in this system. Will eliminate the MERV 16s; those won't be needed. But the beauty of that is, so not only they have HEPA filters as their final filter, but they've got an extra set of UV lights that are shining 24/7 on the HEPA filter. So not only will the HEPAs capture the virus, but the UV lights will do their job, and they'll go to work killing it. And if that isn't enough, they've got these additional boosters that are in sequence right before each of their operating room with the miniature fan and a secondary HEPA filter in there that goes to each OR. He wanted to install an individual UV light shining on that HEPA filter as well. So when I mentioned best practices earlier, you know, there's good, better, and best, and this is the recipe right here for the best. I mean, I am so impressed at the steps this person is taking, but at the same time, their owners understand, A, you know, they're going to be able to pay for all this with 1 or 2 procedures, and secondly, they're going to feel safe and comfortable knowing they're not going to have any possibility, at least through the air distribution system, they're not going to have somebody contract coronavirus because of somebody who was sick elsewhere in the facility. And that's what I wanted to comment there, just because it was so impressive.
We've had a couple of questions online about what it takes in terms of a UV light system to kill viruses on the fly, moving viruses. Can you address that? What steps did you take, engineering steps you take to make sure that that was happening?
Okay, so that's a function of speed, time, and intensity. And that's oversimplifying it. It's similar to carbon. You know, you give the carbon more time to absorb the odor out of the air, it's going to do a better job. Same thing with UV. You want the strongest intensity bulb possible. And I think there's a question prepared for this. The strongest intensity bulb possible, and depending upon, I guess, you know, you could put, for example, 1 bulb every 12 inches in a ladder system. I mean, is that over-engineering? In a TB situation, that may be necessary just to make sure that you've got 6 log reduction in that contaminant. But even with just normal engineering, you're going to get a 5 log reduction in the contaminant as it goes by, assuming that you've got the right intensity of bulb. And understand that just because it's a pretty blue light doesn't mean it's going to get a high kill rate. And I use that term very loosely because we're not actually killing it. We're breaking through the cell wall, we're getting into the DNA or the RNA actually, and we're scrambling up, we're breaking apart the strands, making that virus cell incapable of growing or duplicating. And the term is deactivate. We deactivate, which makes it ineffective, and then it eventually just dissolves and becomes carbon dioxide and water. So I can't say you kill it, because if something's to be killed, it's to be killed immediately. It's a deactivation. But you can get up to 5 log reduction with a properly designed system. So what does that take? I'm doing this from memory. I would have to consult my my resources, but I'm pretty sure it's between 5,500 and 6,000 microwatts per cubic centimeter. And that is a function of the intensity of the bulb, the distance of the bulb, well, in this case, you're talking flyby, and the amount of bulbs. So it can be done. It absolutely can be done.
Okay, a couple of questions on what effect the UV light has on the filtration media,
Right.
As well as the HEPA filtration media. What you got these UV lights shining on the HEPA filters. What effect is that going to have?
That's a great question. And
go ahead.
And Okay, sorry, that's a great question, and I was going to add on, so that's perfect lead-in question as well. What Chris was talking about, you know, UV light works, right? It's worked for years. It's worked on coils and drain fans. Now we're just trying to put these in-duct and in-room type UV lights. So it does absolutely work. And as I mentioned in mine, UV light salespeople are doing a great job in the marketing to the hospital. But hospital people that are listening, please be aware that you know, the UV lights do a great job. The wavelength is such that they're the most intense, and don't be fooled by the light. The tanning bulb, it's much stronger, but it breaks down polymer, and it polymer strands, which is plastics and synthetics. And so if you currently have a synthetic media filter, if you add UV lights without accounting for it, just like the virus, that UV light will break down that polymer synthetic media down into dust, such that the airflow, the air velocity through the air handler will blow it away. And so we need to look at a glass type of a media if we're adding UV lights, where those filters are getting UV lights, even if it's a little bit, it breaks it down, just like a little bit of sunshine out there on the beach can get you.
Okay, we've got one more question, and that is about HEPA filters. Standalone HEPA filters, air cleaners. I think, Chris, you have some experience with that. Can you tell us a little bit about HEPA air cleaners?
Typically, that portable HEPA unit are useful in when the HVAC system is undergoing repairs in the hospital, when there's construction going on. But the issue with that is that the fact that the hospital is not satisfying fresh air requirements with regards to outdoor air. So you cannot place the HVAC system with it. Can it be used as a supplemental system? It can, and they specifically mentioned that if a portable HEPA air cleaner is to be used, that it should be an industrial grade unit, and it should be capable of recirculating all of the air within that room through that HEPA filter. And the unit should be designed by itself to achieve the equivalent of 12 air changes per hour. And any of us is capable of doing the math, you know, width, height, depth, figure out your cubic footage of the room, calculate your CFM, and you can calculate your air changes per hour. So it can help, but at the same time, I would also caution you to not have a false sense of security with this, because first off, industrial grade HEPA filters are going to be made a little bit differently than the little $50 ones you can buy at Lowe's. So sending the maintenance crew down to Lowe's with a credit card to buy a half a dozen portable HEPA air cleaners may not necessarily be in their best interest. But if they do research industrial grade HEPA air cleaners, they can help, they can supplement, and there's no doubt in my mind. My company, like many filter distributors, does represent a line of portable air cleaners, and we have had these questions. For the most part, it's been used in office buildings, they've been used in dentist offices, and I'm not saying that they're doing this without a desire to try to provide cleaner air. You know, they understand that there is going to be some calming effect to their employees and their customers, knowing that they're apparently doing something that is just as equivalent to what it's actually doing. I mean, can it capture the coronavirus? Sure. As long as you've got, again, enough air changes per hour and a legitimate HEPA filter in there. So, yeah, they can be beneficial. And again, they certainly can supplement whatever you're doing within the facility.
Well, I think we've run out of time. In fact, we're a few minutes over. I'd like to thank Steve, Joel, and Chris. You've just done a wonderful job in your presentations, answering questions. I think it's a very impressive overall job. Thank you so much. And with that, I think if anybody has any additional questions, they can certainly send them in to NAFA we'd be glad to pass them out to the participants. But thank you for your attendance in this event, and we wish all of you well. Tony, off to you.
Thanks, everybody. Yes, there are
there.
several questions I think that are we weren't able to get to. So everyone, if your question was not asked, I will gather those all together and I'll send that off to our panel. And I'm gonna give you guys some homework, okay, guys? And you guys can respond to those by email. Perfect.
We'll do
All
it.
right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much. We have recorded the webinar. We will post this up on our YouTube channel here, probably within probably by, let's say, Monday at the latest, and we'll put it up there and we'll make the slides also available there. Thanks so much for listening. Oh, by the way, one more thing. This will also be turned into a podcast. So if you're driving around, you want to listen to this, obviously won't be able to listen to see the slides very well, but you can listen to these guys' vast knowledge. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you.